Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with Operation Torch. As you can see, we have just had the Americans invade North Africa. Now, I full disclosure here, I had made a couple of episodes before I decided to scrap them, just flowing straight on from the original defeat of the Soviet Union, and there was no Operation Torch. And then I noticed something, because I hadn't been paying enough attention. Italy had actually taken Gibraltar. Okay, you take Gibraltar and also take a couple of provinces here. Enough. It shuts down Torch entirely. Just boom. No Torch landings. Because obviously, if you have a reasonable amount of air power here, you can't get through with ships without significant loss of life. Now, you could, of course, invade Gibraltar itself, and attack and bomb it and defeat it that way, but that's a different condition than a scripted Torch. Now, so what I did was went and looked at the code once I realized, because I knew the code had a check for Gibraltar and the other no. Obviously, I knew we had taken the Suez. I didn't realize that we had taken, or Italy had taken Gibraltar. So I went in and removed the check for is Gibraltar and or the Suez controlled, so that it would fire. Because I'm sort of prepared for it, and I wanted to do that. Now, what I also and so just recently though been talking with my friend Revolverheld, the wonderful guy who makes German graphical augmentations, though it's much more than that now, about alternate, because he made a bunch of events sort of leading up to a bunch of those Rommel is reinforced events, leading up to this invasion. And so he wanted to maybe go in and tinker with some of the stuff. And so we talked a little bit about other alternates. We're obviously talking about alternate history and the possibility of the Axis controlling Gibraltar, or the Axis at this point controlling Suez. What would have been done? And it would be quite reasonable. I could see the Americans doing it because it would be fairly lightly defended to invade just Morocco. Just do a Morocco invasion and push around there. Also, I thought of, even if the Allies are holding out somewhere here, if I don't know, somewhere, do an invasion somewhere around here. And even if the Allies control that, like down in Eritrea or somewhere, just still sort of plop down invasion style a bunch of American forces to sort of reinforce. Because after playing that last British campaign and able to really look and see all the primo units sitting back in the U.S. guarding, internal central U.S. positions, is just ridiculous. It really effing is. So, I've talked to some people why, I don't play the U.S. rarely. I've done it a little bit as Hearts of Iron 4, but rarely play as the U.S. is just because it's almost just too easy. There's no challenge. But playing as Britain, you've got a period alone, and also, of course, since the U.S. often just sort of sits at home, or in a great manner sits at home, it's Britain sort of pushing and facing it out. So we also talked about the possibility of like an invasion in South Africa, or whether a counter invasion into Australia, even if not all of Australia has fallen, but just some of it has fallen, do an invasion which would equal reinforcements in Australia. But if they're being held and there's just check in some locations that there's Axis troops in India, again, U.S. reinforcements there, but only if there's, because you don't need to stick in a bunch of U.S. units, drop them in there to either have them be sent home or to just have them sit there and do nothing. But so he is working on some scripted invasions under certain conditions. So, but what I did, because primarily, if I tinker too much with this install, I can't, saves don't work. If I add even some graphic files, I've tried just even minor additions to it, the save does not work. So, but if I tinker with some of the files that are already there, they do work. So we have here is a U.S. invasion in which we are, but if you notice, there are a few more divisions, because I have reinforced it and doing well enough. I figured the U.S. would send more units because we kicked their butt way too easy. In one of the playtesting things, when I was testing to make sure that the invasion would work with the modifications, so I went in and just, at first I tried to create new fictitious units, but somewhere I put in an error, and so I just simply copied and pasted, and we have multiples of some of the historical units. Oh well. So better job could be done, but even by me now, but I'm just afraid of tinkering with it too much and then having the whole, trust me, I save a copy of untinkered files in case I make mistakes, but to put it back in, but I don't want to kill this playthrough just because of my stuff. Okay, so that's what's happened. We have the torch invasion here. Okay. Yeah, figure school. Yes, we'll take the money. Okay, so I'm trying to save up money. Yeah, we'll do it. To build the Atlantic Wall, because you have to have a lot of money to build the Atlantic Wall. Okay. We'll start with this. They have decided Operation Torch. Operation Torch was a British-American invasion of French North Africa in World War II, starting the North African campaign. November 8, 1942, the Soviet Union had pressed the U.S. and Britain to start operations in Europe, open a second front to reduce pressure of German forces on the Soviet troops, while the American commanders favored Operation Sledgehammer, landing in occupied Europe as soon as possible. British commanders believed that such a course would end in disaster. An attack on French North Africa was proposed instead, which would clear Axis powers from North Africa, improve naval control of the Mediterranean Sea, and prepare for an invasion of the soft underbelly of southern Europe in 1943. Okay, a couple of things on that topic, and obviously this is all with gamers' hindsight here. I do believe a cross-channel invasion of some sort. I don't know the specifics of Operation Sledgehammer. Would have probably been a failure. Especially you look at the Americans, once they first started fighting the Germans in Tunisia, they did pitifully bad. That was just because the troops, the commanders, were just unprepared for what a real modern fight. They did okay against the French, but then you got to remember two things. One, the French were very lightly equipped. They were mostly colonial garrison troops, and yes, I've read some articles that they were much stronger than they appeared to be on paper, because they were limited in size by the Germans, how big the overall army could be, and so, companies got bigger, battalions got bigger, brigades got bigger, in the sense of more troops without necessarily like reporting unit size increase or more units to the Germans. So they got bigger and stronger, recruiting up both local indigenous types as well as Frenchmen that they living in North Africa or other places, that they were increasing. And I do believe some shipping out of troops from France, recruits from France too. Especially they were sending out to some places officers they thought would be a little bit more loyal to Vichy. Because especially before the Americans got in, late 1940 and through basically all of 1941, just in December, it looked like Germany was going to come out on top of this. Not that Britain necessarily was going to fall or collapse, but Germany was going to come out on top. And to try to, part of the agreement was, as we've seen in earlier events, was to keep the rest of France from being unoccupied. France had to do a reasonably good job of trying to keep its colonies unoccupied by the British primarily, or the Free French. So just be at peace and we'll leave you alone was sort of the kind of thing. And after the war, you'll get Paris back and some significant amounts of occupied territory back at some point. At least that was sort of the bargain. What would have been what would have kept had the Germans been victorious? We have no idea, because we have seen historically conquerors, as they conquer more, start taking more and more and thinking they can control more and more. So, but that was sort of the thing. Now, the soft underbelly of Southern Europe, that is definitely a Churchillian viewpoint. I'm not sure that he created the term, though I think he did. Europe doesn't have a soft underbelly. This is a misnomer. Now, obviously they took out Italy because, one, the Italian people weren't war hungry. They weren't war hungry in World War One, but they were badly affected by World War One, even though they were on the winning side. They weren't war hungry later. They were tolerant of Mussolini beating up some, natives somewhere. That was fine, but they weren't, they didn't have anything to prove. The Germans had something to prove as a people, that they were defeated in World War One. They had to sort of prove that, hey, we're really great. So, so they really did sort of get behind the war effort as a people. The Italians were on the winning side. They had a fairly big empire, or even if not, you want to call it empire, but various, territories around, Trieste and Split, and some of the, well, not maybe Split, but some of the islands along the coast, even before, you're getting Albania. So they were, pretty happy with the situation and weren't looking for massive wars. So you have that element to Italy, that they weren't, war hungry, and as well as on this point is Italy was not industrially prepared for war. It just wasn't. My Italian friends, I'm sorry, however great you may think your nation was, it was completely freaking unprepared for World War II. It was not a great power, as great powers. This is before the days of superpowers. Italy was not a great power. It wasn't even Japan. And Japan is just barely there. I'm thinking the Soviet Union, Britain, France, Germany were great powers. America was a great power, though not a great military power. They were very under-militarized at the start of this. But they were, as we can see historically, had more than enough industrial power to build up any sort of military. And that goes back to England. To truly understand America, you have to understand England. One follows from the other. England had a historic low view of standing armies. They did not want standing armies. They respected the officer class, because that was sort of the gentry class. Whether they were professional officers or militia type officers, they were respected. But hey, you could be an officer without a unit. I mean, that was sort of like, they sort of presumed, oh yeah, you're an officer and a gentleman and, Captain so-and-so, but you didn't need a company or a battalion in peacetime. You could just be that army officer. And hey, when war breaks out, we're fine, because hey, we have the Navy. They wanted a big standing Navy, though it did get bigger in wartime. We war breaks out, we're fine. The British Navy, this is obviously in the days before aircraft and whatever, the sailing ships. We're fine. The Navy's going to protect Britain. We'll raise the army once the war gets started. And so, sure, you have a few, because Britain did have a standing army, but the government and the people were unhappy to some degree with it. But they wanted, reservist type, skeletal forces, some professional sergeants and, like I say, officers, sort of, skeletally to be there, that, veterans from the previous war, 20 years ago that are, had been lieutenants that are now majors or whatever, that would flesh out and raise up an army. And if that army goes overseas and gets defeated, oh well, we'll raise another one because we're protected by the British Navy. So meaning they could go lose and their nation isn't gone because it was protected by the Navy. Well, that you have to understand, that whole mentality gets transplanted into the U.S. So after every major war the U.S. has, its War of Independence, the War of 1812 with the British, because to the Americans at that time that was a major war, the Civil War, and World War I. After all these, the Spanish-American really wasn't considered a major war, or the various Mexican forays, but after the major wars, the army is radically reduced to what it was before, or maybe even smaller than before the start of the last war. Because, hey, we've got this great navy. Mexico really isn't going to be able to invade us. They tried, failed miserably at it. Eventually, once the U.S. got Texas as a buffer zone, Mexico can't invade us because, hey, you don't invade Texas. Trust me. Mexico, once Texas gets into, independent and then becomes part of the United States, Texas is well armed. And the Mexican army marching into Texas is, just marching into, some of the best militia in the world. So you don't, as I say, don't mess with Texas. So you really, sort of a buffer state there. So, even what, the 1880s or whatever, you might send an expeditionary corps into Mexico to beat up on some bandits across the border, but they know that Mexico isn't going to invade, and Canada, well, they really weren't worried about an invasion from Canada. Now, so after all these wars, the U.S. Army demobilizes because the great bulk of the men and the officers are citizens, not soldiers, or citizen soldiers for the war, but go home. They're like in the British Navy, straight lines on the cuff is you're a regular officer. Wavy lines is that you're sort of a reserve officer or whatever, or a like a wartime only officer. I don't know exactly what they called those. Meaning you weren't a professional naval officer, and so that you were raised for the wartime. So even though you had the same rank as somebody else, your status was shown as different. The U.S. doesn't do things like that. I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Eisenhower was like a colonel at the end of World War II, officially, in his sort of official unit or whatever. It was, now he was a 4-star general in commanding the European theater for the, rank for during the war, but his like permanent war or permanent rank or something was like colonel or something. And I probably did change at some point. But, so there was sort of like your permanent ranks that you saw go, and then this, you're raised. Because you look at also, Colonel Custer, General Custer, Colonel Custer. Colonel Custer, when he's killed at the Little Bighorn, because that was his rank, where he was a general in the Civil War because that was sort of his brevet or temporary promotion for the mass army when we were fighting the Civil War. And obviously after that war, I think he goes back to being a captain and eventually gets, or maybe a major or something, and eventually gets promoted back up to colonel, fighting the Indian Wars. But that's sort of the difference between, in America, the small professional army that all Americans, whether it was fighting Indians or whatever, again, knew we needed, but we didn't need a large mass army, and all the professional army officers knew, oh, yeah, I may be a general now, but once the war's over, I'm going to be back being a major or colonel or something like that, commanding that size of a unit at that point. So that is how America functioned. Now, there was a major change And the famous, and it's often the left hits the right over the head with the military-industrial complex, which was obviously a term coined by General Eisenhower, basically as president, though, as watch out for it. Yes, but it was obviously realized in the age of air power and ballistic missiles, because Germany had ballistic missiles, the V-2 missile, and nuclear weapons. You couldn't just have a navy protect you long enough, so to build whatever sort of army was needed. And, part of it is also, the, if you will, capitalist America is why maintain huge numbers of World War I tanks when you don't know when the next major war, whether it's a world war or simply a U.S.-Japanese war, or a real major war, but just between two major powers, when what the technology will be when the next version of the war comes out. So we just build the new good tanks because, hey, we have navies to protect us that were at least tried to. Obviously there was the Great Depression and various limitations to productivity. I know we've taken a long time. Maybe I'll remember to put a note if you want to skip all this, but try to keep the U.S. naval power up to strength, though, with the disarmament conferences, which obviously saved America money, not having to build too many big ships, but did sort of push for some carriers, and there was lots of fight over all of that. But battleship versus carrier advocates in the U.S. Navy, everyone protecting their own turf. But, that was sort of what was to protect America. So America is, by any means, a great power militarily. In 1939, it just can't deploy troops until 1941 or 42, because its whole premise is we protect our two oceans with big fleets, and then we'll build the shit out of things and go and, if you were stupid enough to get us mad, we'll come in and defeat you. That in the modern world is not effective, because fighter airplanes take so much longer to build than they used to. Had numbers back in like the late 1980s, that there was as much square footage, and not necessarily as much manpower because of automation and things, but there was as much square footage of industrial basically industrial capacity, producing aircraft in, let's just throw out a year, 1988, as there was in 1944, or whatever the sort of the height of World War II. But we were producing so many fewer, just on an order of magnitude, like 1% of the amount of aircraft or something, because F-16s and F-18s at the time, and now we've gone to the Raptors and newer stuff, are just so expensive and take so much longer to build that we can't just spin them up for the next fight. They've got to be ready to go now. Tanks, they sort of got to be ready to go now. The Blitzkrieg shows us you could lose all of Europe while America is building more than enough tanks to go and kick out whoever the latest bad guy is. So we've sort of learned some of the lessons there. But that's sort of the great power status. Italy was not a great power under those things. It was trying to be. And I would say give it another 10 or 20 years, Mussolini would have had it there. But it wasn't there then. So you have that factor. And two, you have the factor of why Italy goes out is, first, they lose an army here to the British. Their first initial invasion, they basically lost it all. Then they have significant attrition to the British, back and forth. Rommel comes in. Then the El Alamein situation happened, and basically the great bulk of the Italian army the Italian army was the major army facing the British at El Alamein in the size of manpower and numbers. Germans were the better equipped, but the Italians were larger. And so basically all that's lost. Not that there aren't Italian units escaping, I'm sure they are, but it was not nearly as well motorized. There wasn't enough fuel. Basically, Rommel gets out what he can, including their German infantry units that don't get out. So not even all the Germans get out, but the great bulk of the Italians don't get out of the El Alamein, or not, yeah, the El Alamein sort of battle. That escape. And then Italy raises more units and sends them into the Tunisia situation. Though I think this time it's now a majority German. I'm not sure on that, but they get in, and that army is obviously destroyed. And then the army in Sicily is destroyed. And so by that point, the Italian people weren't really itching for a war in the first place. And now they've had... also, of course, remember the army down in Ethiopia has been destroyed or captured or whatever. So you've had multiple armies destroyed. And so you no longer have, reserves to throw at the situation. And that's why Italy collapses. But that doesn't mean that Italy is the soft underbelly of Europe, because Italy, the geographical location is this. Hills, mountains, narrow fronts. Greece, hills, mountains, fairly narrow fronts, especially come down here, and here you got that. You've got Yugoslavia, rather underdeveloped structurally, infrastructurally, I should say, trains, railroads. You aren't going to move the same kind of army that you moved, and they had to do the Red Ball Express and whatnot. Various Red Ball is just the famous one, but there are multiple truck expresses based on different ports. I should move these further over to the side so we're not having to jump around so much as you move along here. But even there, the railroads, which primarily it was the Americans and then laterly the Germans as they were retreating, were destroying critical elements of the rail structure. There's still a lot more roads and road choices going through here. And even if you blow the bridges, Americans have nice Bailey bridges that they can, put up when they're not under fire to get across most of the rivers. So even blowing the bridges doesn't really help you sort of long-term, immediate, get out of immediate being shot at. But a few hours later, within a day, Americans, if they got a bridge handy, they're right across that river. And it takes major things like the Rhine to make you have to do floating bridges, but they're also traveling with plenty of floating bridges. There just isn't the infrastructure, the road size scale to get through this part of Europe at this time. So this is not, Yugoslavia is not a soft underbelly. Even if you push all the way up into here of, in Italy, you got the Alps, the Austrian, Swiss, French Alps. You're locked in here. You had the Einsanzo front right here. They actually have a place called that here? That's the river, I believe. That they went back and forth in World War I. This is all pretty well defendable. Now, I do believe they may be over-fortified. Again, I've talked about that because of the Americans and British natural inclination to do naval flanking elements, because again, to understand America, you got to understand Britain, and because we are an offshoot of British culture, we're not just the same. Trust me, I've lived in Britain. We're not just the same. Americans have different cultural viewpoints. It's not just rock and roll music and tacos. It's other deeper things too. But we come from the same basis. Even though we are a big continental country, we are also a naval power viewing, as well as, a shipping peoples. And so we just see, you got a super defensive line? We'll just go around it. How many times do you want us to go around it? So entrenchments, building defenses, yes, but I think Germans overdid it on some of their lines. But the reason I do agree with the idea of trying to delay, and if you're, Napoleon's right. If you're in a fortress and the enemies get you in the fortress, you're lost. Even if they only have 10% of the forces, just because you're got that mindset that you're defending in the fortress. And so this is, again, like in Tobruk, they kept those, and this will probably end up being a special episode. I'll have to mark this because I going to start playing the next episode, because I'm having too much fun here talking about this. Like the Tobruk defensive pocket, specifically, I forget the commander, wanted to keep that mindset of being always on the defensive, so he set up the night raiders, the commando types that were going out and attacking, small unit actions of the German and Italian besieging forces each night. So they wanted to keep it as an active offensive kind of thing, even though that they were on the defensive. So, Napoleon's right, is if you have this fortress mentality, you're lost, ultimately. At whatever point, however long it's going to take, you're lost. Now, you can, at some point, change from a defensive fortress mentality to an offensive mentality, but so long as you have that mentality, you're lost. And the Germans realize that once Italy collapses, they can't immediately rush in enough troops to push the Americans and the British out. Had they had large enough forces, I think they could theoretically have. And obviously, if they haven't, but within the realities of the time, if they realized that they really were going to need that many forces, and the Italians were going to collapse, not that the Italians would have told them beforehand, but if they read the mood well enough, and were able to get enough forces down early enough, they very well might have been able to do a counteroffensive and push them out. It's well known that the Anzio beach landings, I believe it. Yep, got that one right. Were basically unopposed, and they could have marched right into Rome at the time, but the Americans didn't do that. Mark Clark didn't realize that, so he was setting up all kinds of forces, and the Germans were amazed. They could have pushed them in. But yes, had they been sort of prepared for it, had the Germans been flexible enough, had they been there, they could have, pushed the Anzio forces back in the sea. Again, not with all their forces wherever, Monte Cassino is basically where the line was here. Not with all the forces dug in and fighting and holding there, but had they been sort of prepared to rush back and slam a few divisions into the beach landings, they could have pushed that out. But they were just entirely unprepared. Now the Germans were able to sort of encircle the Anzio landings and make it much, much harder to fight it out. And that allowed them to withdraw their forces. But once you get in that attitude, you're losing. Now, and they also realized that they did not have the forces to push the Allies out of Italy. So they knew they were going out. Smiling Albert Kesselring knew that he was going to lose. Now, if they could have won in Russia, then you would have had, like what I had, endless amounts of forces come in and we're going to push them out. Or get some super weapons, super tanks or something like that never happened. You could push them out. But they knew they were going to lose, so it was a delaying action. So that's why I'm sort of against the idea of how the levels of fortifications that they made, if you understand this to be a delaying action. And the reason that it's good to delaying action, because if you were to just, we're going to come and defend the Alps because they're defensible, the biggest problem with that is you've now set up a place with enough ports that they could get into functioning, working to another whole bomber offensive against Germany, against the rail infrastructure moving through here, against Ploetzi, and that's part of what they were working on. Because coming from Egypt, flying to Ploetzi is quite doable with the right type of aircraft, but it's much more difficult. I think most of the major bombing raids were coming that like B-24s or something, I don't know. I'm not good with the air stuff. Coming after Ploetzi, were coming out of southern Italy. So the more you come up here, the much more damage you're going to see. So it was mainly to keep off air attacks that you're fighting in here. Now the Germans were smart enough under I keep sort of messing up this guy. I read his book, so that's why I remember. And yes, the book makes him sound. I'm sure he makes him. Oh, is he? I thought he was here. I'm down here somewhere. Long line. Yeah, von Singer und Etterling. He was in charge of the German forces in Sardinia. and he made a masterful retreat out of Sardinia, across the water to Corsica, out through Corsica into Italy, basically getting all of his troops out and all of his equipment. I mean, it wasn't just, arrived in boats and guys with rifles. No, he got his trucks, his tanks, his whatever, artillery pieces out, including stuff they got from the Italians. So he did and it wasn't, there was no landings at the time, but there was obviously naval and air operations opposing him, and he was able to withdraw it. And so, again, I don't remember whether that was approved or not from Hitler. He was quite famous, hold or die. But he realized that once the, Allies were firmly ashore on Italy, trying to hold these islands was senseless. With the forces available, it was better to get them to fight somewhere else. So, yeah, there is. Oh, and also coming, the only sort of maybe soft underbelly is southern France, especially if it's Vichy held. But we get to Case Anton. Operation Anton, Fall Anton in German, was the code name for the military occupation of Vichy France carried out by Germany and Italy in 1942. The German plan to occupy Vichy France had originally been drawn up in December 1940 under the code name Operation Attila, and soon became considered a single operation along with Operation Camilla, the plan to occupy Corsica. Operation Anton updated the original Operation Attila, including different German units and adding Italian involvement. Following the Allied landings in French North Africa on November 8, 1942, Operation Torch, Adolf Hitler could not risk an exposed flank on the French Mediterranean. Following the final conversation with the French Premier Pierre Laval, who by this time is very much a collaborationist, Hitler gave orders for Corsica to be occupied on the 11th of November and Vichy, France, the following day. Basically, one of the descriptions... Oh, we have this thing to deal with, but I'll deal with that next episode. Basically, one description I forget... I'm thinking... Not Waffen-SS, SS, but maybe it was just German occupation forces. Basically, was that morning, somebody's like waking this officer or clerk or something up, and he's sort of describing the stuff, just a magazine article I read on it, and get your rifle and your kit. What? Because he's like just some sort of clerk type. They just literally got every single German uniform person, and I mean that literally, in this part of the world, just about literally almost every single German uniformed person. So whether the Orpo, Luftwaffe, garrison type forces, or ground air crews type things, or your commissary, your cook type units, and everybody just go get your gun, whether it's a pistol, because some of these guys were just sort of armed with pistols, as not necessarily even as police, but just you're an airplane mechanic, or you're a Luftwaffe ground officer who's in charge of airplane mechanics. You have a pistol. Just get your guns, get your basic whatever field kit you have, and assemble out in front of your building kind of thing, or wherever your local roll call assembly type location is. And they just immediately got all these people into trucks and started moving into France. Yes, this wasn't a mad scramble, what do we do? There was a plan, but the plan was basically just get every single person you could and drive into France. And that's basically how Case Anton was. There was definitely an attempt to try to get the French fleet, and so that there was definitely Commando maybe overstating some of this stuff a bit, but there was definitely some better military units to try to secure certain assets, but just to go in and occupy. So basically, if you were doing an occupation job in occupied France, including guarding a bridge somewhere, for the next few days, that's no longer important. You're going to southern France to occupy it. Then obviously at some point all this is worked out, and whatever units get occupying. So this is your one potential soft underbelly. But even here, you've got a fair amount of mountains. You can't really push into Italy without hitting mountains. You've got a ways to go before you can get to, proper German industrial areas. And and this is, in some of the earliest reports, Hitler was really worried that, because they got reports that the fleet was spotted coming through the Straits of Gibraltar by the Spanish and German observers in this area. And they were really at this point sort of, and this is before the, sort of in the first few hours of this, an invasion in southern France. The problem with that is distance. Not that you can't get there, because some of the ships that landed troops here came from the continental U.S., but the idea of resupply, of continuing supplies through potentially hazardous zones. You not only have, you have Italian forces that could be moving as well as German forces moving in. You've got air power that can shift and come off of these islands that, particularly Sardinia, is Italian armed. And if at that point, because you got to remember, when we're sort of starting out, Operation Torch, it's basically the same time that the El Alamein stuff is going on, or around that time. I'm not exactly sure of the date, sorry about that, but still a good portion of North Africa is being held by the Germans and the Italians. The Italians are far from giving up, because they maybe are just going through the losing of the El Alamein facing army, but they hadn't lost the other army. So Italy was still looking like the ability to bomb ships, and so you've got tenuous supply lines that, and they've definitely had the experience of supplying stuff to Malta, getting through, but at very costly, to loss of ships and lives. And supplying the Malta garrison versus supplying a major invasion, and not just supplying the troops as they land, but the army groups that eventually are needed to create a second front. Because the U.S. weren't going to create a second front, which maybe, I don't know what Stalin's thinking. Of course, Stalin is a greedy, psychopathic narcissist who's only worrying about himself. So he may not really care, or doesn't really matter. But the Allies had no intention of landing here and creating a bridgehead pocket to create stalemate, just to create fighting. If they were going to invade, Churchill didn't want to do that, because he already had his first soft underbelly of Europe, of Gallipoli, that didn't quite work out. That's sort of why I'm on this viewpoint of soft underbellies in Churchill. He did not want, and he realized what, obviously, his disaster at Gallipoli happened, and it was his disaster. Didn't want another one of those, whether, in the Peloponnese or something. They did at some point, under Sir Churchill, take an island or two in Greece and then abandon it because of German air power. They couldn't keep it supplied, but they thought it was going to be limited. They did successfully invade the island and take the island. That was no problem, but they couldn't maintain enough air cover, and basically shipping was, too much of it was being sunk to get there. Even at this sort of late state, Churchill was trying to set the stage for post-war Europe and wanting to get British control here, and sort of get brownie points for liberating some islands, but they couldn't hold them. But that's a limited objective, not a peninsula stalemate, death zone situation. So, sorry if I'm zooming in and out too much, but I'm trying to use it to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So, Churchill definitely did not want another Gallipoli. The American whole military mindset is, we're getting this war done now. We're going to land, and we're going to move, and we're going to keep moving. We're not going to stop. This isn't going to be, can we hold a bridgehead? Can we hold out for a while? We're going to hit and smash and roll on. And if it means a delay, because notice this is November 1942. It was December 7th. Basically 11 months before is when the U.S. really starts entering the war. And I think it was the 9th that hit. December 9th, I think it was, that maybe it's the 8th, but 8th or 9th that Germany declares war on the U.S. So it's not even till then that the U.S. is doing its first major ground attack in Europe, which was already determined to be the primary, the first most important front for the Americans to take before, the Pacific is the second front. Now, obviously, you had American immediate problems in, the Philippines and other places that ground action was already starting, and so when they were sending troops, to Guadalcanal and other places to fight this out, was already happening, but that was because it was sort of immediate ongoing thing. So, but America was going, hey, yeah, if it takes us a year to get there, basically, it takes us a year to get there, but when we come, we're coming heavy, and we're coming hard. And that was the whole American attitude. So, like I say, this initial force was obviously enough to take Vichy France. They knew it. They knew that they were going to get minimal resistance, partially because it's, colonial troops with few or outdated equipment, and that most of the troops, including most of the officers, didn't want to die for Germany. I mean, there were definitely officer types that were vehement anti-communist and saw the Germans as a bulwark against communism, and they definitely saw some of the idea that France was close to revolution, and if the Soviets win, the revolutionaries are going to win in France, and France is going to become communist, and this is worse than temporary German occupation, so let's try to keep the peace. But even those guys, especially once America's in it, and once they start seeing, because they experienced what America can do in World War I, that the tide was going to change in who's going to be in power in France once the war is over. That has now changed. It's not necessarily going to be the Soviets liberating France from Germany. It's going to be the Americans, so they're not going to want to die for the Americans, though maybe very willing to fight British opportunity invasions, if you will, and British naval attacks and other things like that, and get really pissy with the British. But they are not looking at dying for Germany. So even the like I say, even those most likely to support the Vichy government aren't going to put up real resistance, die-hard resistance, and they didn't. There were Americans killed, there were French killed, there was real fighting, but it wasn't, to the death, if you will. In that once a position became untenable, oh, okay, yeah, we'll surrender. If we're in a good position, we'll fight you. But once you flank us, once you get in a good position, yeah, we'll surrender, and that kind of thing. And that's sort of, we'll put up a good fight, but once that's over, it's over, and we'll join the Free French forces and help you out. And so this is going to be Operation Torch, Case Anton talk. You can post questions below. I don't know how much detail I answer. I do better talking than I do trying to type it all out. But that's sort of the situation. There isn't a soft underbelly of Europe. But I am very much in agreement with clearing the Axis out of Africa. That's a different matter. Clearing the Axis out of Africa, collapsing or taking some of the islands, because again, those are limited objectives. It's taking Sicily. Sicily's pretty big, but it's still just taking Sicily. Could have been, never was, but could have been a counter invasion of Crete. Those are limited objectives that you can start by through air and naval powers, starting to starve out the garrisons and cut down on supplies coming in, and then take it out and keep, through that, again, that naval and air power, keep reinforcements from coming in. A bit harder for coming across Sicily, but here you can do it easy enough. So you get the isolated targets, take them down, even places like Rhodes and some of the other places, take these things down while you're building up for your main invasion. And yes, going after Italy is a good thought, and I agree with basically what they did is that you don't smash your head against defensive lines that Albert Kessering, and again, I'm not knocking the defensive lines as their effectiveness for defending the line, and they were pretty effective at defending the line. It just, since you didn't have command of the sea. See, that's something that the British often did particularly in the Napoleonic Wars, including down here in Sicily, was do sort of the thing in Wallachern. Sorry, I'm continuing on this, but this is sort of a long dedicated episode. Wallachern, I don't know. You read things, you don't get the right pronunciation here. Expedition is basically a low-lying swamp up here that's in this part of there. The British invaded during the Napoleonic Wars and basically got stuck, and everyone died of disease. Those that died, there's almost zero. There was one sort of battle thingy, but even that didn't kill very many people, or even wound very many people. Many, many more died of the disease. Mosquitoes and poo infecting the water and whatnot. All the unpleasant things of a Napoleonic warfare. The British Expedition Army basically failed because it couldn't break out, and it died of disease. But Britain was sort of good at these kinds of things because it controlled the waters around it. Even when great fleets couldn't operate, they could control in small boats because they were just such excellent seamen and were equipped, so that they could hold that kind of a Kesselring defense. If you wanted to do that, again, like I say, Churchill learned his lesson, especially in offensive ones. The Gallipoli thing. Now, if he could have turned the Gallipoli around, creating a death, because there was also a similar death invasion of Greece, I think somewhere around here, that there was a couple 100,000, even bigger than the Gallipoli thing, allied during World War I, and landed and basically became another pocket that just disease and other things killed off more people than the shooting did in Greece during World War I. But that if you have the naval power to hold the sea flanks, obviously in World War II it needs to include the air power as well, because they'll sink the Navy if you don't have it. If you do that, so if you had, I guess theoretically, if you had a bigger Italian and or German Air Force, you had the Italian Navy, the French Navy effectively transferred to German control maybe, and or Italian sailors control, that made this region unable to effectively do naval invasions. If you had enough aircraft sitting on bases in Corsica and Sardinia and here, enough, whatever that is, that you control the air things, even if the Allies can get across to some place like Sicily and up here, they can't do other invasions. They might be able to, do sort of reverse North Africa and bring ships in along the coast here under their air umbrellas, get them here, get them under their air umbrellas across to Sicily, and then via railroads and whatnot up to the front. That's quite possible. But if you could effectively sink, because you can get enough air power here within range here and cut off naval invasion, then the fortified lines of Kesselring, who was, remember, gotta understand, you gotta know who the players are to understand the war. Kesselring was an artillery officer in World War I, so he understood World War I battlefields, World War I networks of fire, for artillery and trench work. So he was modern. Instead of the old World War I big slit trenches zigzagging across the whole front, he was modernizing it into foxholes and pillboxes and tank turrets sort of concealed and all that kind of stuff. So he knew that kind of war and that kind of fighting. So he knew what he was doing there. He knew the premises. And he was also a good Luftwaffe officer. Not young enough to be a good pilot. A good fighter pilot, you got to be young. But I'm sure he became trained to be a pilot. And got air war. He understood air war. So he understood those things. But he may have thought he was going to be able to win the air war. And hence sink any invasion fleets once he got one of the zones. But Germany was unable to win that air war. So that would have made his thing. So you got to, again, understand who the players are to understand why they're thinking. But he just couldn't win that air war, and the Americans and the British are just natural invaders from the sea. We're the sea peoples. So, again, this is going to be the real end of the episode. So thanks for watching. Thanks for liking. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more great thoughts from Gamer. And of course, please post questions, comments, corrections. And I do mean that because I get dates and some things wrong. Please post the corrections so that we correct the record for people who come by after you can read the corrections down below. I do appreciate that. Thanks so much. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.